Hi, everybody. I hope you're having a good Wednesday. This is our Wednesday Bible study. One of the things I want to encourage you to do is as you're going through the Bible study, if you have a piece of paper, why don't you write down some of the notes you might have, and you can share them in comments throughout the day. And I'll be checking back in throughout the day today to see if you have any comments or questions and to try and interact and respond. I want this to be as close to a Bible study as possible where you get to interact. Part of what makes our Wednesday night Bible studies work so well is that we talk back and forth, and I want that to be a part of what we're doing. Now, if you haven't been with us before, we're going through the book of Ezekiel. We are ready for Ezekiel chapter 7. Just kind of a quick background to what we're going through here. We have Ezekiel is a prophet who was prophesying during the final days of the fall of Jerusalem. Now, he wasn't actually prophesying from inside of Jerusalem. Instead, he was prophesying while he was already in exile. There are actually several waves of exile before the final destruction of Jerusalem. And he's over in Babylon with one of these groups of exiles, these refugees who have been forced to resettle there. And he's acting out the signs. He's acting out the prophecies that he's doing. And so he's got this brick that he's drawn the outline of Jerusalem on, and he lays siege to it to symbolize what's going on back at home. And he goes through some very elaborate sign acts where he's describing with what he's doing the horror and desolation of the destruction of Jerusalem that is going on so far away. And we've got this here. This is The Flight of the Prisoners by James Tizet. And, the people, they could hardly believe that it was going to happen, but it did happen that the city of Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was destroyed, all the people were led away into exile, not just a couple of people. And Ezekiel was called to the difficult task of telling the people of Israel in exile that this is what's going on back at home. Now, as we begin to get into the passage, let's start first by looking at the structure of the passage itself, because the way the chapter is structured is it's divided into three separate prophetic oracles. There are two short oracles. These are pretty generic doom and gloom oracles. If you were going to go and look at other books of the Old Testament, other prophetic books, like, say, for example, the book of Amos, it shares a lot of similarities with books like that. And it would really hit the Israelites who were reading this or listening to Ezekiel talk. It would hit them really hard if they knew the book of Amos, because the book of Amos is the last prophet before the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel. If you don't remember your Jewish history, after King David, his son King Solomon introduced idolatry into the kingdom. And because of that idolatry, God allowed the kingdom to be divided, to be split between the northern 10 tribes who became the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern 2 tribes who became the kingdom of Judah. And about 150 years before Ezekiel, the kingdom of Israel fell, and it never came back. The people just disappeared. And so as they're listening to Ezekiel talk, that's what's going to be going on through their minds. Is this what's going to happen to us, that we're going to disappear too? Now, we know on the other side of history, that's not what happened, but they didn't. And it would be pretty terrifying if you really believed Ezekiel. There is a third oracle. It is longer, it's more detailed, and it actually splits up into 3 parts. With the last part kind of being a double part, so it's almost like there's 4. These 3 parts it describes the coming economic impact that the siege of Jerusalem is going to have. There's also a psychological impact that it's going to have on the minds of the people there. And there's a spiritual impact that's going to happen. And it's all going to be wrapped up into how God is involved in the siege of Jerusalem, the destruction of Jerusalem, and how the people are going to respond to it. Before we move into the text itself, I do want to say a quick word about repetition. If you read through this with me, you'll notice there's a lot of words and ideas that get repeated over and over again. Words like the end has come, your doom has come, the time has come. These words, they appear nearly a dozen times in just the first 9 verses. And there's a reason for that. Because the ideas that Ezekiel's telling them, it doesn't fit with what they think, how they think the world works. Ezekiel, he's trying to deal with the myth of Jerusalem's invincibility. The people, they had this idea that because God was with the Jewish people, because God's temple was in Jerusalem, because the Davidic kings were there, and God made a promise to King David, he would never let Jerusalem fall. And that's the myth that Ezekiel's trying to deal with. Now, it's not like they were pulling that out of thin air. They actually were looking at the Bible itself and coming away with that conclusion. Now, I'm going to read a couple passages of Scripture here real quick. And I want you to kind of take off your Christian mind here for a second. I hate to say that, but I want you to look at this the way that they would. They don't know there's a Messiah coming yet. They don't realize that Jesus is going to come along 500 years later and fulfill all these prophecies, and that there's a different way to see it. So I want you to think about this the way that they do, that there is a king in Jerusalem that fits this description. That God's holy city is a real place with a temple on it. And so I'm going to read first this passage in 2 Samuel chapter 7, where God makes this promise to David. The Lord declares to you, the Lord himself will make a house for you. When your time comes and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up after you your descendant, who will come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he does wrong, I will discipline him with a human rod and with blows from others. But my faithful love will never leave him, as I removed it from Saul. I removed him from your way. Your house and your kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. And so you can kind of see there that if you don't really have an understanding that there's a Messiah like Jesus coming later who's going to fulfill this, it'd be really easy to read this and think, well, God's never going to let Jerusalem be destroyed. There's always going to be a Davidic king here, because look at what God told David. And the city itself, well, if you were to turn to Psalm chapter 48, you grow up reading this psalm, I'm going to read it to you. You tell me what you would think. The Lord is great and highly praised in the city of our God. His holy mountain rising splendidly is the joy of the whole earth. Mount Zion on the slopes of the north is the city of the great king. God is known as a stronghold in his citadels. Look, the kings assembled, they advanced together. They looked and froze with fear, they fled in terror. Trembling seized them there, agony like a woman in labor, as you wrecked the ships of Tarshish with the east wind. Just as we heard, so we have seen in the city of Yahweh of hosts. In the city of our God, God will establish it forever. God, within your temple, we contemplate your faithful love. Your name, God, like your praise, reaches to the ends of the earth. Your right hand is filled with justice. Mount Zion is glad, the towns of Judah rejoice because of your judgments. Go around Zion and circle it, count its towers, note its ramparts, tour its citadels, so that you can tell a future generation. This God, our God, forever and ever, he will always lead us. You have in that very passage a little bit about how their king's going to be coming to fight against Jerusalem and them being afraid because God is there, about how God is always there. He will endure forever. The city will endure forever. And it's really easy to read that and think, well, you know what? It doesn't really matter what we do. The city will always be here. God will always find a way to make sure the city is safe. And even if we're evil people, even if we give into idolatry, even if we are in servants of injustice and we don't bring justice to people, even if we take advantage of the vulnerable and the poor, God just can't destroy the city. Yeah, he might rough up the countryside a little bit. He might make us pay tribute to a foreign empire for a little bit, but he would never let the city fall. And what Ezekiel's coming and doing is he's saying, God isn't bound by your limited understanding of what the Bible says. And I think that's a really important lesson for us to learn today as we go into this. Is, God is the one who understands the Bible fully. The rest of us, we're still trying to figure out what it means. It's okay to assume you're right. If you have an idea where you think you could be wrong, you shouldn't assume you're right about it, but nobody goes around thinking, well, I have this idea and it's wrong, but I'm going to believe it anyway. If you think you're right, you think you're right. That's okay. But it's very dangerous to assume you could never be wrong. And that's the mistake that the Israelites made here. And it's something that Ezekiel's trying to address. They believed that God would never allow Jerusalem to fall no matter how evil they became, and they were wrong. Now let's get into the text itself. Beginning in verse 1, we're going to look at the first oracle here. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, this is what the sovereign Lord says to the land of Israel. The end has come upon the four corners of the land. The end is now upon you, and I will unleash my anger against you. I will judge you according to your conduct and repay you for all your detestable practices. I will not look on you with pity. I will not spare you. I will surely repay you for your conduct and for the detestable practices among you. Then you will know that I am the Lord. And so what we see here, the first thing you might notice is that God tells Ezekiel to actually prophesy against the land itself. And when he says prophesy against the land of Israel, he doesn't mean the nation of Israel or the country of Israel. He actually means the literal land itself, the soil, the earth, the dirt. This would be a really, really heavy, hard thing for the people to hear, because Ezekiel's saying that the earth itself is going to suffer for the sins of the people. This is the promised land. This is sacred territory for God, and God is allowing it to suffer because of the sins of the people who were in it. The truth of the matter is, this is true not just of the world we live in, but of the people around us. Whenever we choose to sin, it doesn't just hurt us, it hurts other people too, and it hurts the world. There are a whole lot of people who will suffer for the sins that you and I commit who didn't have anything to do with it. That's just the way that sin works. Sin is an equal opportunity destroyer. It likes to destroy you whether you're guilty or not. And we go on, it says, I will judge you according to your conduct and repay you for all your detestable practices. And in your own translation, if you have a different one like the King James, it might say abominations instead of detestable practices. And what this really amounts to is it's telling us the kind of people that we have here. They're people who their conduct, their character, it's bad people with bad character. They're not treating people with justice. They're not doing what's right. They're breaking God's moral law. And they're practicing abominations, detestable practices. This is idolatry. They're worshiping false gods. And you have to remember that this isn't just coming out of nowhere. This is after 400 years. God has been waiting patiently for 400 years. And 400 years is enough. And at the end of the 400 years, there's nowhere else to go. If there's no other way for them to know that He's the Lord, then this is what it's going to take. That's our first oracle. Let's move on to the second. Ezekiel 7, 5 through 9. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Disaster, unheard of disaster. See, it comes. The end has come. The end has come. It has roused itself against you. See, it comes. Doom has come upon you who dwell in the land. The time has come. The day is near. There is panic, not joy, on the mountains. I am about to pour out my wrath on you and spend my anger against you. I will judge you according to your conduct and repay you for all your detestable practices. I will not look on you with pity. I will not spare you. I will repay you for your conduct and for the detestable practices among you. Then you will know that it is I, the Lord, who strikes you. So, It's like Ezekiel actually kind of ramps it up even more. There's much more harsh, stronger language. We go from just the end is come to disaster, doom. The day is near. And that's kind of, Ezekiel doesn't dig into it much, but that's a little bit of a slight reference to the day of the Lord. The day of final judgment when God will judge all the nations. And so it's almost like there's a little bit of that piece of the final judgment that God has taken and just kind of dug up into this moment, where God pours his wrath out upon the people. And one of the things that I want you to notice is there's this panic, not joy on the mountains. What does he mean by that? Well, the people of Israel, they had these festivals throughout the year which were filled with joy, with shouts of joy. And in the original Hebrew, it actually talks about them shouting for joy. But instead of shouting for joy, they're shouting in panic. And in the old days, when the covenant between God and Israel was the way it was supposed to be, the people, they would gather on the mountains and gather in the cities, and they would shout for joy together. But now that's been replaced. The covenant's been broken. And instead of shouting for joy because their relationship with God is the way it's supposed to be, they're shouting in panic because the wrath of God is coming upon them. Now let's move on into the last and final oracle. It'll take us a little bit to get through it because it's so long, but here we go. See the day, see it comes, doom has burst forth, the rod has budded, arrogance has blossomed, violence has arisen, and a rod to punish the wicked. None of the people will be left, none of that crowd, none of their wealth, nothing of value. The time has come, the day has arrived, let not the buyer rejoice, nor the seller grieve, for my wrath is on the whole crowd. The seller will not recover the property that was sold as long as both buyer and seller live. For the vision concerning the whole crowd will not be reversed. Because of their sins, not one of them will preserve their life. So what you can see here is now God is describing how this has happened. I really like the way that the New Living Translation translates verse 11 here. Rather than talking about them as separate, and in the original Hebrew it does kind of bind it together more. It says, their violence has grown into a rod that will beat them for their wickedness. And that's really kind of the imagery that Ezekiel wants to get across here, is their own violence, their own wickedness is turning around and biting them. It's the idea of what goes around comes around, and what they've been doing to others and the evil that they've been doing for 400 years is finally coming down on their heads. And it's going to affect everybody, all of them. And the first effect that we see is the effect of their wealth. All of their wealth, all their value, nothing is going to be left. They're going to be facing total and complete economic failure, economic collapse, to the point where even buying and selling become pointless. When you're under siege and your food is running out and there's nothing left, money, buying and selling, it doesn't mean anything anymore. And one of the things I do want you to notice as well is there's this reference to the year of Jubilee. And we don't pick up on it because we don't keep the Old Testament covenants, the Old Testament festivals. But one of these festivals was every 50 years the Jews were supposed to have a buyback program where anybody who had to sell their land, they were able to buy it back for the same price, a fair price that they sold it for. And what God is saying is that this has been reversed and there's no land left for them to buy back. They're all gone. The year of Jubilee is over. The festivals are over. The covenant between God and Israel is breaking down because of the sin that they've had and God's wrath coming upon them. And there is no reversal here. This is going to affect all of them. None of them will be able to preserve the life that they had. There's no going back here. This is total and complete economic collapse. Today we have this idea, and I think probably rightly so, that At some point we'll make it through this pandemic, and after a couple of years of hard work and tightening our belts, we might be able to get the economy back to where it was before this all started. And like I said, I think that's probably true. They have a similar idea of, we'll just wait this out. This siege will pass and things will go back to normal. And what Ezekiel's saying is you guys are wrong. It's not. This is the end. So, we always have to be careful not to make too many assumptions. Going on into the second part of this last oracle. They've blown the trumpet. They've made all things ready, but no one will go into battle, for my wrath is on the whole crowd. Outside is the sword, inside are plague and famine. Those in the country will die by the sword. Those in the city will be devoured by famine and plague. The fugitives who escape will flee to the mountains. Like doves of the valleys, they will all moan, each for their own sins. Every hand will go limp, every leg will be wet with urine. They will put on sackcloth and be clothed with terror. Every face will be covered with shame, and every head will be shaved. And what we see here is we shift from economic failure to psychological failure. It's like a collective mental breakdown, meltdown. The people are so overwhelmed with how crazy things are that it breaks them down mentally. And I think I wouldn't say we really understand this completely, because we're in nothing like that kind of a situation, but I think we do understand it a little bit better now than we would have 2 weeks ago. I know people who they get a little stir crazy just from having social distancing and not being able to go out all the time. That wears on you. Now imagine having that be the case where your entire life is under siege. That's what's going to happen to them. That's where they're headed. And it's the point where they prepared everything for the siege, but by the time the siege comes, they realize God's against them. And the next thing you know, the people, they're just done. And no matter where they're at, there's no escaping from it. If they're outside the city walls, they're caught up in the sword, the army of the Babylonians. And if they're inside, they're caught up in the plague and the famine that comes with siege warfare. And so it doesn't really matter where you're at. You'll either be killed by soldiers outside the city or killed by famine and disease on the inside. Now, there are a few people who will escape. There will be a few fugitives who flee, manage to make it into the mountains, where they're going to cower like doves. This is actually a little bit of a reference to the way that Assyrians, the precursors to the Babylonians, the empire before the Babylonians, they like to record all these sorts of things when they would make people run from them in fright. And one of the things they talked about, pretty common in the Middle East, is this idea that if you run from battle, you're like a dove being scattered, startled out of the trees. And so there's a bit of that in there. But there's also this sense in which, I guess it's true whether you're a soldier or not, but especially if you're a soldier, your hands go limp, they go nerveless, because you're so terrified that you drop your weapon and your shield. And you're so scared that you literally wet yourself. Man, it's like you mentally break down so much that you just stop, and your bodily functions just go. When you pee your pants, you're scared. That's essentially what's going on here. And terror and shame are so overwhelming that it might as well be the clothes they wear. That's really what we find here, is terror and shame come to define them. It's like they're clothed in terror. It's like they've been shamed so much that they've had their hair cut off, which is one of the most shameful things you can experience as an Israelite man. Let's go on to the last part here. They will throw their silver into the streets, and their gold will be treated as a thing unclean. Their silver and gold will not be able to deliver them in the day of the Lord's wrath. It will not satisfy their hunger or fill their stomachs, for it has caused them to stumble into sin. They took pride in their beautiful jewelry, and used it to make their detestable idols. They made it into vile images. Therefore, I will make it a thing unclean for them. I will give their wealth as plunder to foreigners and as loot to the wicked of the earth who will defile it. I will turn my face away from the people, and robbers will desecrate the place I treasure. They will enter it and will defile it. So what we see here is this is spiritual failure, idolatry failure on the part of the people, and it takes two forms. First, the most obvious reading is their love for money, their love for mammon has failed them. And they've put their trust in their silver and their gold, but in the middle of a siege, what good does that do? When there's nothing left to buy, money's not going to buy you out of your problems. You can't bribe your way out of God's wrath, and you can't eat your gold and silver coins when there's nothing left to buy. And so their money's failed them. But there's also another twist to this, and you kind of start to see it a little bit in the last verse here, or the last part of verse 19, is it's not just their gold and their silver, their wealth, it's the idols they make out of them. And they've made idols out of silver and gold, and those idols that they've made, their idolatry, it's not going to save them. Their dead idols aren't going to protect them from God's wrath, and they can't eat their idols any more than they can eat the coins in their pocket. And then God, He gives us a little bit of an image of how this idolatry's come to be, and we're going to dig a little deeper into some of the Hebrew imagery here and some other translations. But this is essentially, it's more detestable than it looks in this passage. Going on to verse 20, some of the other translations, and I think they're better translations, they're more accurate to the Hebrew, rather than saying that they took pride in their beautiful jewelry and used it to make detestable idols. The better translation is that God took pride in His beautiful ornaments, but then the Israelites, they used it to make detestable idols. And if you read the English Standard Version or the King James, it's in those translations. If you read the original Hebrew, it tends to point more in that direction, and it makes more sense with what we know happened. If you go on to Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 17, it reiterates that point and talks about the Israelites using God's silver and gold to fashion idols. And so what we see here is the kings and the priests, they've melted down items from God's temple and made idols to false gods with them. And it's impossible to know exactly which all articles were used for this. We know some of them were. One of them may have been the Ark of the Covenant itself, though. We know from Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 16, that by the time Jeremiah is prophesying near the end here, the Ark's already gone. And so that means either the Ark was taken into Babylon and lost, or destroyed. I mean, Jeremiah essentially says it's destroyed. It's gone, and no one's going to rebuild it, which suggests that it's been destroyed. Not that it was taken and will come back, because a lot of the stuff that was taken by the Babylonians, Cyrus sends it back later. But the Ark of the Covenant's gone, which you can't prove it, but there's a pretty good chance that it's gone because they took the silver and the wood and tore the Ark of God's Covenant apart and used it to make idols. They did to all kinds of other stuff. And if that's the case, then that's a pretty horrific thing. And what God is saying here is, well, He's going to take all the wealth, all the idols, everything they've put their trust in, and He's going to let the foreigners, these Babylonians, come in and plunder it and defile all the things they think were sacred. Even the things that they thought God would never allow, the things that were actually sacred to God, even the things that the people said God will never allow that to be desecrated. God allows it to be desecrated. God allows the people to suffer for it, even if it means His own temple will be destroyed. Now we come to the end here. This is the closing part, where it kind of wraps up everything else. Beginning in verse 23, prepare chains, for the land is full of bloodshed, and the cities full of violence. I will bring the most wicked of nations to take possession of their houses, and I will put an end to the pride of the mighty, and their sanctuaries will be desecrated. When terror comes, they will seek peace in vain. Calamity upon calamity will come, and rumor upon rumor. They will go searching for a vision from the prophet. Priestly instruction in the law will cease. The council of the elders will come to an end. The king will mourn, the prince will be clothed in despair, and the hands of the people of the land will tremble. I will deal with them according to their conduct, and by their own standards I will judge them. Then they will know that I am the Lord. So you can see here that God is preparing chains for these people. This is what's going to happen, is they're not going to get out of this. They're going to be led away into captivity. Anybody who does survive, they're not going to be there to rebuild the land. They're going into exile like everybody else has. Why? Because the land's full of bloodshed. The city's full of violence. It's been full of violence before this ever happened. Because of their bloodshed, because of their violence, because of their wickedness, God's going to bring one of the most wicked countries in the world to come and take their houses, their homes, their pride, their might, their sanctuaries, the things they think are holy. Take it all away. And what we see is that when reality finally sets in and they realize where things are going, there's nowhere for them to turn to anymore. Everywhere they look, every way they turn to look, there's no way out. It's all blocked. When they turn to the prophets, there's no prophetic word for them other than doom has come. Usually you go back and you read through the Old Testament prophets before this. They would prophesy many of the same kinds of things. Things like, your sin is going to lead to destruction, but turn to me and you can come back. But here it's too late. It's too late. There's no going back. It's all destruction. If they turn to the priests, there is no priestly sacrifice that the priest can make to cover this sin. It's here. It's overcoming them. There's nothing in the law to fix what's broken here. And the wisdom of the elders, the counsel of the elders, there's no wisdom they can come up with that's going to help them get out of this. God's wrath has come. His justice has come. And when it comes, there's no stopping it. And what we find here is that from the highest king to the lowest beggar, from the highest to the lowest of all the people, they're all going to be brought down equally. This is the end. They're going to be led into exile, and there's no coming back, not for this generation. Their life will never go back to normal again. There's no waiting this out. This is the end. This is the end of them as an independent kingdom. This is the end of life as they know it. There's no going back. Things will never be the same again for them. Now, one of the things I do think we need to keep in mind, because of how frightening this is to think about this, is we have the benefit of living on the other side of this book, so we know that they did go back. It took 70 years. It was really their grandkids that went back. And we know that even though there's no king that sits upon David's throne, there is a king who sits upon the throne of heaven who is of the line of David. It can be very easy to read the passages in Ezekiel in despair, and I don't want us to do that, because we have hope in Jesus, but we do need to read this and take it seriously. And I hope that you do that. Now, if you have any questions, put them in the comments. I'll try and answer them the best that I can. I hope you'll all have a good week. I'll close this in prayer, and then I'll see you guys next week. Would you bow your heads with me? Dear Lord, thank you that you have given us the prophet Ezekiel to speak truth into our lives. Lord, the leaders in our country, they're facing hard decisions right now. Us as individuals, we're facing hard decisions right now. And if the book of Ezekiel tells us anything, it tells us that how we handle our situation really does matter. I ask that you would help us as a nation, help us as individuals to go forward in integrity, so that we could know that we're being faithful to you. I ask these things in your name. Amen.